Thanks, Maria, and thank you for having me today. So the photograph or the image that I wanted to talk about today is this one here, which was taken by Tim Hetherington during the Second Civil War in Liberia, which was from 1999 to 2003, during which time Hetherington was one of only two photojournalists, or journalists actually, to travel with the Liberians United for Reconciliation and Democracy, or the LURD forces. The other journalist was James Brabazon, with whom Hetherington was working. For those of you who don't know, Hetherington was a British photojournalist. He was a conflict photographer, he was a mixed media communicator, and he was also an Oscar-nominated filmmaker. His archives are held by the Imperial War Museum. For those of you who want to check him out, it's quite extensive and there's a great deal of research to be done on it. Now, Hetherington's work took him all over the world, to Sierra Leone, to Angola, to Liberia, to Afghanistan, and also to Libya, where he was sadly killed in Misrata in April 2011. Hetherington was perhaps an unconventional war photographer in that he did not particularly care about photography. Rather, for him, photography was just the means of an end. It was a way to explore further the topics and issues which interested him. Now, we often associate photojournalism as bearing witness, as documenting events in a visual manner. But for Hetherington, his work was actually about trying to understand his own fascination with conflict and war, what attracted him to it, why he kept going back to it. And it was also about connecting with the people his work brought him into contact with. He was interested in what he called the software of war, or the young men who fought in it. Hetherington began to develop and explore several theories or questions that he came to through the observations he made through his camera. He talked a lot about the idea of masculinity in conflict, but also he started to develop this idea of what he called the feedback loop. Now, the feedback loop is the self-perpetuating link between the reality of conflict and its portrayal in popular culture. The two are interwoven together. Combatants echo the fictional depictions of war while they're in combat and vice versa. In other words, mimicry becomes interwoven into war. It's layered into it. The feedback loop then shapes not only how young people in war portray themselves, but also how global audiences understand these conflicts. As Heck and Schlag point out, photography of war and violence, stands out as the most striking example of how visual representations shape our own understanding of conflict. Now, the idea of the feedback loop is well founded in the relevant scholarship. Gibson dedicates the first part of his discussion of violence and manhood in the US to the ways in which some American soldiers in Vietnam War, tried to reenact the film scenes they had seen or read about in war fictions. There's references to Michael Hare's accounts of soldiers acting like war movie heroes during network television news and during firefights. They were embracing their performance for the audience. Gibson also talks about the idea of John Wayne becoming increasingly important to those in Vietnam. In a circular fashion then, the young men who went to fight in Vietnam were imitating the films about World War II and the American cowboy, and they themselves were then producing the imagery which would inform the films about their war. And as such, the young men in the future who would go on to fight in Iraq or Afghanistan. Tim Hetherington himself highlights the visuality of the Vietnam War in the tattoos of the men he photographed in the Kongal Valley in Afghanistan. Images and tales of warriors in war then shape combatants' ideas of how to perform and how to behave in conflict. It tells them who they are and about their commitment to each other. However, the hypothesis of the feedback loop is a little more difficult to navigate when the combatants aren't just drawing upon visual representations from their own cultures, but are taking them from elsewhere around the world. We have to understand why and how this takes place, and what does it tell us about those involved. So if we turn to this photograph here, as I said, it was taken during the Second Liberian Civil War. And the young men in this photograph have found numerous inspirations for their performance, including the most evident, which seems to be that of the American gangster. We've got the bandanas, we've got the sunglasses, we even have the American flag. And these ideas are often associated with rap artists of the 1990s, such as Tupac. Now, in the scholarship about the Sierra Leone War, Tupac is touched upon by people such as Utah's and Pressholt. And that we begin to develop about how these young men took this icon and made it their own. Now, I use the word performance here for a reason, and it links to the title of my talk, the idea of the subject as co-creator and as the colliding scapes come together. As you can see from this photograph, the majority of young men in it know that they're being photographed. They are aware of the photographer and they're responding to him. There's a thumbs up, there's waves, they're holding their guns, they're parading them to be seen. There's some smiles, there's some more serious faces. In other words, to use the words of Nicholas Mercer, they've become visual subjects. They are aware of the fact they're being seen. They want to be seen. And perhaps there's some agency in being seen. And that leads me to some of the ideas that I've been developing. By reframing these youth combatants in such a way, we're able to begin to ask questions about how the subjects of photographs want to be seen, and what their performance and the props that they choose tell us about how they place themselves in both the local and the wider context. In other words, how they understand themselves in relation to their audience. In Jane Brabazon's documentary, Liberia, A Journey Without Maps, this collision between the local and the global is visually evident. Young combatants walk towards Monrovia, the capital of Liberia, wearing bandanas and sunglasses, quite similar to the subjects of this photograph. And this is the clothing associated with the music videos of the 1990s, American hip hop music videos. These are global influences that were taking place among these young people. At the same time, their faces are painted white, which is a tradition associated with the Poro societies. Around their wrists, they have pieces of string, and around their necks, the talesmen, to protect them from bullets. The visual components of bulletproofing. They're seemingly parading their strength to the camera. They talk about eating enemy hearts. They dance and they sing. Some of them are wearing football shirts, others army fatigues, some the dirty orange t-shirts of the Lord. And they gather around the camera. They're singing, they're standing in formation, they're chanting. They are performing for an audience. And perhaps their different audiences involve different ways of performing. One of those audiences can be the photographer with the camera. In this image then, we have a similar expression of power, this time associated with the American gangster imagery, or even Rambo films. Now, journalists and conflict photographers alike have spoken about how young combatants in particular do things like shoot from the hip during conflict. This isn't an effective way of firing a weapon. However, it is the way that we often associate with American gangster films or American Hollywood films. In the scholarship around Sierra Leone and Liberia, anthropologist and photographer Danny Hoffman has argued for what he calls the presence of digital media, but also the economy of attention. To profit from this economy, combatants and non-combatants were required to play to an audience, an international audience at that they knew was there, even if it only existed in the abstract. When we think about an international audience in this photograph, it's a little bit easier to grasp. The man taking the photograph was a white British man, over 6 foot tall. Perhaps to these youth combatants, he represented that international audience. The image there then is just one example of how youth combatants in Liberia were straddling what I could call youthscapes, while living in a warscape, while also being influenced by a mediascape. I'm aware of the fact that I've just used escape a great deal number of times there, so please bear with me while I explain it a little bit further. Now, the notion of escape then was first suggested by Aparundi, and it covers the multidirectional entanglements between people, places, and power. A warscape, as defined by Nord Stream, a place is characterized by brutal violence, political volatility, and physical insecurities. Liberia during the Civil War. At the same time, we have youthscapes, and this is the idea that youth, or the construction of youth, takes place during the complex process of globalization. Young people are aware of the world outside of their local. They understand of youth elsewhere in the world, what they might have, what they might want, what is available to them. And this helps inform what it means to be young in particular cultures. And at the same time, important to this idea is the notion of mediascapes, the dispersal of images and texts to both small and vast audiences. Youth, including youth combatants, are consumers and producers of these kind of images. So what was witnessed in Liberia then and Sierra Leone was not just the collision and the entanglement of the global and the local, if we look at icons such as Tupac in relation to the more traditional ideas, but also a negotiation between youthscapes, warscapes, and mediascapes. And they were performed and curated by everyone involved in the image making, not just the photographer, but also those subjects in the photographs. So what images such as this then offer is a starting point. It's a beginning to re-articulate the relationship between the subject, the photographer, and the audience. If we assume that the photographer isn't the only storyteller of a photograph, but rather the young people involved in them understand war and photographs as sites of performance, of theatre. Can we begin to explore how young people in Liberia understood their place in the world, and also begin to ask questions about how they wanted to be seen and by whom? Youth are calculated, they're tactile, and they're users of different discourses, and they move throughout their environments. As Susan Shepherd points out, she describes seeing ex-combatants manipulate their images for the media. On occasion, they ran and they grabbed their sunglasses and their bandanas and they donned that kind of outfit. They donned that performance. Or they dressed in their commercial traditional clothes. Again, they performed for the media. If it was needed, they adopted the posture of an innocent victim, in a way they never would do in their everyday interactions. What do these performances tell us about how they understand the people who are looking and what it means to be seen? What then does a chosen performance or assumed visual narrative in a photograph suggest about how these youth combatants situated themselves within both their local and global, and how they understood their audience? Thank you very much.